The film actually deals with a lot of trauma that journalists face now. It's a kind of thing where they get so into covering wars. They cover wars too much sometimes, and they begin to lose touch with normal life back home in Europe or America. One of the things that happens to journalists sometimes is they start to get so into the lifestyle that they can't get out of it. And they start having problems with drugs, alcohol, especially if they've been involved in a really traumatic occasion, like somebody near them has been killed or they themselves have been almost killed. What happens is they start being unable to cope in things like day-to-day life. And one of the things in our film, it shows a psychiatrist who has been called in many times around the world to cope with or to treat some of these reporters and journalists who have been suffering from post-traumatic stress. Post-traumatic stress for a journalist is exactly the same as what a lot of soldiers face. It's a kind of thing that can creep up on them sometimes, or sometimes there's a real break and they just break down. My partner in the film was a psychiatrist from Canada, originally from South Africa. He himself had been a soldier before he became a psychiatrist, obviously. And he is called in by all kinds of major news organizations, like the BBC in England, CNN. Here in Italy, I think it was Il Messaggero had called him in to treat the journalists once they are unable to handle the problems themselves. And as I said, it can be anything from being unable to cope with personal relationships, nightmares that are far worse than ordinary nightmares, drugs, alcohol, just a general breakdown, and he gets called in. Journalism has changed tremendously in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, a journalist was probably not going to be the target for the enemy. Right now, journalists are more often the targets of the enemy because they know that if a journalist is killed, it gets big headlines. Also, a lot of these groups, who are the guerrilla groups, know that if they kidnap a journalist, the news organizations will pay big ransoms. And this has made a lot of these journalists targets for kidnapping. So the profession is a lot more dangerous than it was 20 years ago. And also, with the creation of satellite news services, it means that the news is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It does not stop. In the old days, 20 years ago, there would be the news period during the day, and then nothing much would happen until the next day. Now it never stops, and that is placing a lot of pressure on a lot of journalists. Most journalists, when they go into combat now, have to wear a lot of armor, special protection. They have to wear special clothing, so if they're caught in a fire, it does not go right into their skin. There's all sorts of things they have to do now. I went to my first war wearing blue jeans and a t-shirt. That is still done sometimes, but not as often, mainly by the freelancers now. Generally, the big news organizations have their people with helmets, with all the body armor, and they basically have to send them into war with insurance and everything else. The role of the reporter is going to evolve technologically over the years, as it has in the last few decades, when people have had to use new equipment. But the basic role of the reporter is never going to change. It's to seek out the truth, whatever it is. That will not evolve unless there is a drastic change in the kind of media organizations that we know today. So I think the role technologically will change, but the basic role cannot change. One of the things we show in the film are Western journalists who go to these war zones and come back home. That is one kind of war journalist. But there are other journalists, for instance, the native Iraqis or the native Afghans or the people who live in whatever country is undergoing war who cannot go home. They are already home. And those people suffer a whole different set of problems than the Western journalists. Those people have to cope with threats to their lives on a daily basis. And that's a far more difficult role to be a journalist in the country that is actually where a war is happening than to be able to go back to Rome, to Paris, to London from the war. So that's a different kind of warfare.